When we think about people who made money in racial slavery in the past, we tend to imagine white plantation owners who profited directly from marketing cash crops that were harvested by an unpaid enslaved Black workforce. Indeed, we tend to imagine something like this. This is an engraving of a generic cotton plantation from the US South made sometime before the US Civil War. Whether or not you've seen this particular image, I have no doubt that you and probably all of your students have seen various images somewhat like it. The image of the plantation, and more specifically the cotton plantation, has become synonymous with racial slavery in the minds of most people who live in the United States. It's where much of our popular media about slavery is set, from Hollywood history dramas, where many of our nation's most famous heritage sites exist. Think about plantation tours at Monticello, Hermitage, etc. And the main focus of slavery's history in most of our school curricula, from textbooks to document and primary source readers. Most young people who read about slavery in school will encounter narratives written by formerly enslaved people, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, who documented life on southern plantations where enslaved people were forced to harvest agricultural commodities for sale in distant markets. As a result of this association, when we think about the people who made profit on racial slavery, we tend to think about the white slave owner. That is, the person whose direct claim over the bodies and the labor of enslaved people was recognized and protected by the law. We think about how owners made a profit on selling the crops that they forced enslaved people to harvest, and perhaps if we go a little bit deeper in our discussions, we also think about how they could profit off of ownership in a variety of other ways. For example, by mortgaging, by renting out, selling, and even breeding enslaved workers, or by offering them as collateral to secure credit or to take out loans in business transactions. In one of the most frequently cited cases, we may think about the white slave owners of the British Empire, roughly 40,000 of whom were paid off by their government at the moment of emancipation in 1837, compensated in about 20 million pounds, today about $1.5 billion, which they then used to reinvest in a diversity of other commercial enterprises, thus leveraging the capital they procured from slavery to move into new industries. Meanwhile, those who were liberated received no payment to start their new lives. Unfortunately, this image we have of racial slavery happening on the plantation and the wealth of slavery accrued by the white slave owner silences more than it reveals about how slavery functioned as an institution in the Western world. It's a result of our modern desire to disassociate ourselves from the legacies of slavery. We want to be told, and we want to believe, that the consequences of racial slavery were limited because the institution itself was confined to a particular setting in the past, the plantation, and to a specific group of people, those who legally owned enslaved persons and directly profited from marketing the fruits of their labor. The result of this image, of course, is that many people now believe that their lives had nothing to do with racial slavery because, for example, their family lived in the North or in urban areas, they moved to societies that had the institution but only after it was abolished, or they do not have any ancestors, at least who they know of, who owned enslaved people. There are places where slavery existed and people accountable for it, this argument goes, but those places are not here and those people are not us. On a fundamental level, this narrative we tell ourselves misunderstands what racial slavery during the early modern or pre-modern period was all about, what it was as an institution, and how it actually functioned as a way to produce wealth for persons of European descent who lived and moved about in the world. For the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to tell you a short story about one white man, Captain John Matthews. He was born and raised in and lived out his entire life as a subject of the British Empire, at a time when it was the Western world's foremost slave trading power. Unlike most of the historical slave trading figures we are familiar with today, Washingtons, Jeffersons, etc., Matthews never legally owned any enslaved people. At least I have yet to find any written record attesting to his ownership. He did not own any plantation land, and he did not oversee the production of any cash crops for the market. Nonetheless, over a period of approximately 4 decades, as a slave trading factor or agent stationed in West Africa, as a sailor in the Royal Navy stationed in the Caribbean, and then a pro-slavery consultant, expert witness, and author in England, he found ways to profit off of his country's investment in racial slavery. And in doing so, he rose from an orphan and an apprentice at sea to a wealthy and respected landowner. Looked at broadly, his life reminds us that racialized slavery was a ubiquitous institution, one that created a wide variety of social and economic opportunities for persons of European descent who lived in its time, and one that cannot be understood as separate from broader society itself. John Matthews was born in the small town of Chester in the county of Cheshire, England in the year 1752, and his father was an artisan silk weaver, also named John, who died in 1755 when Matthews was just 3 years old. His mother, named Anne, died just 11 years later in 1766 when he was just 14. So Matthews was probably raised by relatives of his mother, the Boswells, a family of some prominence in the town. And then following his mother's passing, he was probably enrolled in the Blue Coat School, a local charity institution that, according to one contemporary guidebook, was home to about 35 boys, all of them local orphans, for a period of 4 years, at the expiration of which they were then put out apprentices to sea or to other businesses. Matthews' time at this school would have ended about 1768 at the age of 16, the time when many young men with no titles, no land, and no capital in England started out on apprenticeships during the 18th century. 2 years later, according to testimony Matthews gave to Parliament on the question of the slave trade later in his life, he signed on as a sailor to a voyage headed to what is today Sierra Leone, West Africa. And it seems strange that the orphan son of a silk weaver would enlist in a voyage to West Africa. It should be noted first that Chester was an active port city around 30 miles distance from Liverpool, to which it was connected by the River Dee. By the time Matthews was born, local guidebooks were describing Liverpool as the emporium of trade. In the 1740s, it had actually overtaken Bristol as the epicenter of the nation's transatlantic slave trade. By one contemporary estimate, it was responsible for over half of the empire's entire share of the transatlantic slave trade, with 1/4 of the city's shipping devoted to that business. Investors and bureaucrats created a tight network around the slave trade. For example, politicians on Liverpool's governing body, the Common Council, held their meetings in the city's Exchange Building, the same building where the local branches of the nation's Board of Trade and the African Company also met. As a result, young men relocated from all over Great Britain to this area to pursue opportunities related to the business of the slave trade. For an orphan with a primary school education like Matthews, sailing on a slaving ship was attractive for at least 3 reasons. It provided him a chance at adventure, a salary with which he could sustain himself in his independence, so long as he could handle the difficult labor and survive the hazards involved, and an opportunity to improve his social station by promoting first to a boatswain, then to a captain, then a slave ship investor, and finally, a stay-at-home owner of slave ships in England. Although Matthews entered the slave trading business, he did not buy any enslaved people for himself. His first job was to live on the coast of Sierra Leone as an agent or a factor. In the 18th century, the rates of mortality on a slaving voyage, that is, the number of people who died, was directly related to the length of time that a ship spent on the coast acquiring slaves. The longer that a ship stayed on the coast as a captain bartered to fill his ship's hold with prisoners, the more likely the captives whom he had already boarded were to die from all sorts of causes, including disease, neglect, revolt, and even suicide and despair. To deal with this issue, slave ship owners and investors in Western Europe hired people to live on the coast year-round. Known as factors, these people's job was to use their employers' funds to purchase enslaved people from African slave dealers, holding them as prisoners on the coast, somewhat like goods in consignment, until a ship in their employer's name showed up to board them and send them to markets on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Matthews performed this role from 1771 to 1772. Based out of an inlet on the Sierra Leone Peninsula that was then known to Europeans as White Man's Bay, and supported by the local Koya Temne at an adjacent village known as Yamakuba's Town, he cruised up and down the coast of Sierra Leone, collecting enslaved persons for ships on his employer's credit. After a year, he began attending the Middle Passage himself. Between 1771 and 1777, Matthews served on 3 transatlantic slave trading voyages to the British colonies of the Caribbean. And during these voyages, he helped slave ship captains deliver their enslaved charges to the sugar plantations of islands like Grenada, Barbados, Jamaica, St. Kitts, and St. Vincent. Every time he returned to England, he reaffirmed his value to his employers, and he collected a salary from them, paid off from the proceeds of a successful voyage. By 1777, Matthews was 25 years old, and he had supported himself with money from the slave trade, even though he himself had never owned an enslaved person, a slave ship, or any plantation land. He fits into a role that was well known in his time, but has since been forgotten in ours, that of the white worker employed by the slave trade as a job creator. Throughout the 18th century, advocates of the slave trade frequently cited the industry's role in what they called a nursery for seamen. That is, the place where young men with no alternatives, they were untitled, unpropertied orphans like Matthews, went to learn maritime skills and contribute to the growth of their nation's economy, rather than becoming drains on the state through its parish charity networks or through its prisons. By employing white men like Matthews, the slave trade gave to Europe a way in which its subjects could sustain themselves while feeling patriotic because they supported their nation's commerce. Meanwhile, it kept them off the streets, alleviating the social unrest that was then building up in cities in Western Europe from land enclosures, rising rents, and declining job prospects at home. By the summer of 1778, Matthews chose to transition from the British slave trade to the British Royal Navy. The then ongoing Revolutionary War with the Empire's 13 colonies, begun 3 years earlier, meant that the British military was desperate for soldiers at the very same time that the slave trade was being repressed from wartime privateering. Probably the catalyst for Matthews's enlistment was the British defeat at Saratoga, followed by the entrance in the war of France, England's arch rival, and Spain on the side of the Americans. Matthews's general education and his prior experience sailing in the slave trade meant that he could enlist in the Navy as an officer, not as a crew member. Within a year, he was promoted to the rank of a lieutenant, receiving more respect and a higher salary than he had as a factor or sailor in the slave trade. He served for the remainder of the conflict from 1778 until 1783, later writing 2 books that detailed battle plans of well-known engagements, an image of from one of those books you can see here. In these books, Matthews explained that he served all of the war on the West Indies. He saw action against the French at Caribbean islands of Grenada and St. Kitts in 1779, depicted here, Martinique in 1781, and St. Kitts and Dominica in 1782. Once again, if it seems odd that a young lieutenant in the Royal Navy should spend the duration of the American Revolution fighting in the Caribbean, then we need to remember that the 13 colonies that became the United States were not, in fact, Great Britain's most precious American colonies in the 1770s. In reality, it was the colonies of the Caribbean, not the colonies of the mainland, that were Britain's most productive and most valued overseas territories in the late 18th century. Jamaica, centrally located in the Caribbean basin, was known as the jewel of the British Empire's imperial crown, characterized by one contemporary historian as a constant mine from which Britain digs its prodigious riches. Kingston, its capital and its major port city, was the headquarters of Great Britain's military power overseas, and it was richer than any North American port city, be it Boston, New York, or Philadelphia. That wealth in the Caribbean was built on a foundation of racial slavery and the slave trade. Not only was Jamaica home to more enslaved people than almost any other British American colony, but it was also the staging area for the empire's transshipment slave trade to colonies of other European powers throughout the hemisphere. By the 1770s, the coerced labor of Black enslaved populations on sugar plantations in Great Britain's colonies helped to prop up a complex web of national and imperial industries. Among these industries were shipping, boat building, cask making, investing, stock speculation, iron manufacturing, and the list goes on. Understanding the value of Great Britain's slave-based colonies in the Caribbean is the key to understanding why Matthews was deployed there for the duration of the war. As political theorists of the day explained, the British Royal Navy and the British transatlantic slave trade were twin institutions of national commerce, each one supporting the other. Revenue from slavery helps to finance the Navy, and the Navy defended Great Britain's slave societies, not only from the aggression of rival European empires who ran their colonies shoulder to shoulder with Britain in the Caribbean, but from the resistance of enslaved people themselves. The empire's slave owners and colonists overseas depended upon the British Navy to protect them from slave uprisings, which were more common and more devastating in times of war. Seen in this way, Matthews's deployment in the Caribbean was to preserve British slave societies from what contemporaries called their external, European, and their internal enslaved enemies. Again, Matthews did not actually own any plantation land or enslaved people, but his employment was based on slavery. His service was rewarded with a good salary, and he was reported at the end of the war as living in a house pleasantly situated on the Abbey Green, the central square of his hometown of Chester. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in the fall of 1783, Matthews lost that job. And then the conclusion of the war meant the demobilization of much of the British Royal Navy. So Matthews returned to Chester, and he made at least some cash by printing those 2 volumes mentioned earlier, detailing the battle plans during the war. Then in 1784, he rejoined the business of the slave trade, accepting employment once again as a factor or agent in Sierra Leone, this time for a London-based firm called Samuel Hartley and Company. No doubt this offer for employment came through his friends at Liverpool, who had known about his experience in the region going back to the 1770s. No longer a sailor, Matthews worked in Sierra Leone for over 2 years as a lead merchant. In practice, this meant he personally negotiated with African and mixed-race slave dealers based on the coast of Sierra Leone for the purchase of enslaved captives. He then held those captives prisoner until they could be boarded by his employers as clients who arrived from Great Britain en route to the Americas on the triangular trade. Matthews, of course, was paid a salary for his troubles, and he was also able to use his employer's credit to trade on his own account, storing up additional profits in the form of trade goods that he would try to convert to cash in the colonies on his way back to Britain. It may seem strange to us today that Matthews should move so casually in and out of the slave trade and the British military, but it shouldn't. To Matthews and many of his contemporaries in the 18th century, both the slave trade and the Royal Navy were viewed as respectable industries. Being employed in them was understood by people in England, most people, not all, to be not just reputable but patriotic. Whether Matthews worked as a merchant growing national commerce for the slave trade, or as a soldier defending the empire's subjects and territories overseas, there is no doubt that he and others like him saw themselves as serving their country at the same time that they served themselves. Reflecting in the beginning of a travel book he later wrote on Sierra Leone, Matthews acknowledged that it might seem unusual for someone to move from the glory of naval victories in America to the lifeless scenes of commercial pursuits in West Africa. That being said, he told his readers that he did it for 3 reasons. His previous work in slavery made him an asset to that industry, now reviving since wartime privateering was ending. He knew slavery would permit him to maintain a living that he wrote might not be unworthy of British naval officers. And he knew slavery, like military service, was viewed by most of his peers as an honorable profession, as he said, of essential importance to the naval interests of Great Britain. At the beginning of 1787, Matthews' employers closed down their operations in Sierra Leone. After settling their accounts, Matthews returned to Britain once again, likely delivering a cargo of enslaved people to the plantations of the Caribbean on his way. By the time he landed in Liverpool, about the first few months of 1788, something unprecedented was underway. Pressure from a newly formed London Abolition Society had resulted in the announcement of Britain's first ever official government inquiry into the morality and economics of the slave trade. No sooner had Matthews arrived than he was approached by his associates at Liverpool, the members of the largest slave trading organization, the African Company of Merchants. They offered to put Matthews on retainer and pay him a salary to live in London over the course of the investigation. Matthews would serve this organization as a member of a select hand-picked group of expert witnesses on the slave trade for 2 years. In this capacity, he would lobby influential members of the British government, waiting on them at home and at private events. He would attend regular meetings of other lobbyist groups to share information and new ways to defend the slave trade from its critics. And he would testify before select committees of Parliament in defense of the slave trade, using his personal experiences to advance pro-slavery arguments of the day. Standard ones being that it rescued Africans from a life of violence on the continent, introduced them to European ideas of civilization, enlightenment, and Christianity, and was the foundation of Britain's national prosperity. In addition to paying his salary as a consultant, the African Company of Merchants and a corollary lobby organization known as the Society of West India Planters and Merchants paid for the publication and dissemination of Matthews's travel book, A Voyage to the River Sierra Leone. Now, the pro-slavery lobby financed this text because it circulated pro-slavery arguments among the public, not only through the text, but especially in the final chapter, an essay that advanced a direct public defense of the slave trade. Nonetheless, the travel book was just as beneficial to Matthews personally as it was to the lobby politically. He collected proceeds from the sale of a book that he did not have to pay to produce, and the book served to enhance his reputation as a gentleman scholar and as a knowledgeable authority on topics like slavery in West Africa. To scholars who work on this period of history, he's still known by that text today. Despite the fact that its main purpose was to defend the slave trade from criticism, it contains a wealth of valuable first-hand information on Sierra Leone, like data on its social, natural, cultural, economic, and political makeup in this period. To this day, almost every scholar who writes about Sierra Leone during the early modern period reproduces Matthews' name in their works, often in the main text and sometimes only in the notes. These citations, like the presentation here, are a reminder of how slavery produced not just lasting wealth, but also lasting recognition for white perpetrators. After working as a consultant in the slave trade base in 1788 and 1789 and publishing his travel book, Matthews retired to live in his hometown of Chester with his family before again re-enlisting in the Royal Navy, this time in 1793, to fight the French in their Revolutionary War. For the next 5 years, he was back defending his nation's commercial interests abroad by cruising in the regions he knew best. He guarded Britain's overseas slave networks, its outposts in West Africa, its supply lines in the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean, and its colonies in the Caribbean, while undermining those of its competitors. In the early spring of 1798, he died at sea at the then mature age of 45 from a bout of yellow fever he contracted during his return from the Caribbean. Two sources from Matthews's last years can help us take stock of a life he spent profiting from racial slavery. The first one is an estate sale, which was held at his house on Abbey Green in Chester in 1792. And the second is his final probate record or will, revised during his last tour in 1797 and proved about 3 months after his death. The estate sale shows an opulent house, filled with the period's most modern and elegant furniture. Among the list of luxury items that he possessed, we see handsome mahogany 4-post and tent bedsteads, festooned window curtains, fine goose feather beds, chests of drawers, neat mahogany and painted chairs, Pembroke tables, and some Wilton and Scotch carpets. I don't know exactly what those are, but they sound very nice. In his will, Matthews left behind no less than 2,250 pounds, equivalent to $365,000 in today's value, to be distributed annually in the form of annuities and legacies to his family and friends, charities to philanthropic institutions like infirmaries, churches, hospitals, and the Blue Coat School that he attended in his youth, and also another 6,000 pounds from government bonds called 3% consols to be distributed among his children when they matured. These assets, both monetary and otherwise, are just a sample of the tangible products of a life spent profiting on the opportunities that were created by racial slavery. Their circulation within Britain through gifts and sales reminds us that slavery's benefactors were the descendants of its perpetrators, primarily, rather than the descendants of its enslaved victims in Africa, in the Caribbean, or elsewhere. What can we learn about wealth from this brief biography of Captain John Matthews? Well, Matthews's life has a lot to teach us about how people made money from racial slavery in the early modern period. Yes, of course, white people made money by selling cash crops, like cotton, sugar, tobacco, harvested by enslaved people whom they claimed to own. Of course, a staggering amount of wealth was stolen from the uncompensated labor of enslaved people on plantations like the one you see here in exactly this way. And yet, a person did not need to own enslaved people or even own any plantation lands to make money from slavery. Matthews is just one example of a white person who never possessed legal ownership of an enslaved person or over any agricultural land, and yet still profited continuously from slavery. As an officer in the British Royal Navy, he was paid to preserve the slave colonies of the Caribbean where they were a major source of his empire's wealth. As a so-called merchant in West Africa, he was paid to acquire and hold enslaved people under contract for his employers in England, the real owners according to English law. As a consultant for the pro-slavery lobby and author in England, his salary and sales were based upon his claim to having direct, first-hand experience with the institutions of slavery and slave trade. There is, in fact, an intriguing coda to this biography of Captain John Matthews. In 2017, the daily logbooks that Matthews wrote during his years in Sierra Leone in the 1780s turned up at a Sotheby's auction house in London. Unknown to scholars and lost since Matthews had written them around 230 years earlier, they showed up mysteriously and were put up for sale by an unnamed private owner. Eager to grow their collection of materials related to slavery, the Archives Department of Princeton University purchased these books for $82,000. As a result of the bid, they can be consulted today only at Princeton, despite the fact that Matthews had no ties to that institution or New Jersey. Everyone involved in this transaction, the person who sold the manuscripts, the agents at Sotheby's who brokered the sale, and even Princeton University, which despite spending money, augments its reputation as a premier institution for the study of slavery. They are profiting from it. And so, over 2 centuries after his passing, John Matthews and the works he produced as a product of his lifelong engagement with racial slavery continue to create wealth, and unfortunately, not for the people they should. It is the descendants of enslavers who live in wealthy countries like the UK and here in the USA, and not the descendants of enslaved people in Jamaica, Sierra Leone, or elsewhere, who profit on the history of slavery just as they profited on this practice. Thank you.